Humid air of the Afghan mountains pressed against Lieutenant Sarah, Doc, Martinez's face as she crouched behind the crumbling stone wall, her medic's pack weighing heavy on her shoulders. At 28, she had already served 3 tours as a Navy corpsman attached to SEAL Team 6, earning the respect of some of the most elite warriors in the world. Her steady hands had sutured countless wounds under fire, her calm voice had talked dying men back from the edge, and her unwavering courage had saved lives in situations that would have broken lesser souls. But today was different. Today, everything she believed about herself, everything she thought she knew about the line between healing and killing, was about to be shattered in the span of a few heartbeats. The mission had started like countless others. Intelligence indicated a high-value target. A Taliban commander responsible for orchestrating attacks on coalition forces was holed up in a compound nestled in the treacherous peaks of the Hindu Kush. The 12-man SEAL team, led by Commander Jake Reaper Thompson, had inserted under cover of darkness, moving like ghosts through the rocky terrain that had swallowed armies for centuries. Sarah's role was clear and unchanging. Stay back, keep the team patched up, and be ready to save lives when the bullets started flying. She carried her standard loadout, an M4 carbine for personal protection, but her real weapons were her medical supplies, her knowledge of human anatomy, and her ability to perform miracles with nothing but field dressings and morphine. The compound sat like a fortress against the mountainside, its mud brick walls scarred by decades of conflict. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could make out the thermal signatures of at least 15 hostiles moving within the structure. The plan was textbook: breach and clear, neutralize the target, extract any intelligence, and disappear back into the night before reinforcements could arrive. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Bull Rodriguez had been her closest friend on the team, a giant of a man with gentle eyes who treated her like the little sister he'd never had. He was the team's primary sniper, carrying a customized Remington 700 that he'd named Whisper, for the way it sent enemies to their eternal rest without a sound. Over the past 2 years, Sarah had watched Bull work his deadly craft from distances that seemed impossible, placing shots with surgical precision that would make a brain surgeon weep with envy. As the team prepared for the assault, Bull took his position on an overwatch point 300 meters from the compound. His job was to eliminate sentries and provide covering fire during the breach. Sarah set up her aid station in a depression behind a cluster of boulders, close enough to reach wounded teammates quickly, but far enough back to avoid the initial chaos of the assault. The attack began at 3:47 hours, with the soft whisper of Bull's rifle eliminating 2 rooftop guards. The team moved like a choreographed dance of death, breaching the compound walls with controlled explosives, and flowing into the structure with the fluid precision that came from thousands of hours of training and dozens of missions together. Then everything went wrong. The intelligence had been fatally flawed. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a trap. Hidden passages honeycombed the compound, and as the SEALs advanced through what they thought was an abandoned section, enemy fighters poured from concealed positions like angry hornets from a disturbed nest. The carefully planned operation devolved into a desperate running gunfight in the narrow corridors of the ancient structure. Sarah heard the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixing with the controlled bursts of American weapons, punctuated by explosions that shook dust from the stone walls around her. Her radio crackled with urgent calls for medical assistance, and she found herself running toward the sound of gunfire, her medic's instincts overriding every survival instinct screaming at her to take cover. She reached the compound's outer wall just as Petty Officer Danny, Kid, Morrison came stumbling out, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood streaming down his face from a head wound that had turned his blonde hair crimson. Sarah caught him as he collapsed, immediately assessing his injuries with practiced efficiency. "Frag got me, Doc," Kid gasped through gritted teeth. Bastards had IEDs wired throughout the place, Bull's still up on Overwatch, but the rest of the team's pinned down inside. Sarah's hands moved with automatic precision, applying pressure bandages and administering morphine while her mind raced. Through her earpiece, she could hear Commander Thompson's voice, tight with controlled desperation, calling for immediate extraction. The team was trapped in a kill zone, taking casualties they couldn't afford. That's when she heard the shot that changed everything. It wasn't the whisper of Bull's suppressed rifle or the sharp crack of enemy fire. It was something else entirely, the distinctive boom of a high-powered rifle, followed by a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Bull's voice, calling her name over the radio, weak and fatting. Doc, I'm hit bad." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Bull never called for help. In 2 years of combat operations, she had never once heard fear in his voice. But now, transmitted through the crackling static of her radio, was the sound of a dying man trying to say goodbye. "Bull, talk to me," she called back, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Where are you hit? How bad?" The response came in ragged whispers. "Chest, can't breathe. Sarah, listen to me. They got a sniper, same ridge, 300 meters east. He's picking us apart." Through her scope, Sarah could see the muzzle flash of the enemy sniper's position. The bastard had found Bull's hide and put a bullet through his chest, and now he was systematically targeting any SEAL who showed himself. Commander Thompson's voice came through the radio, confirming her worst fears. They had 2 more men down, and without sniper support, they were sitting ducks in that compound. Sarah looked at Kid, who despite his injuries was applying pressure to his own wounds with grim determination. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she saw her own desperate calculation reflected in his face. Someone had to take out that sniper, or none of them were going home. "Kid, Bull's rifle, where is it?" Kid's eyes widened as he realized what she was thinking. "Doc, you can't. You're a medic, not a sniper." But Sarah was already moving, her mind shifting into a mode she had never experienced before. Every afternoon she had spent on the range with Bull, every lesson he had given her about reading wind and calculating drop, every principle of physics and anatomy she had learned in medical school, it all crystallized into a singular, deadly focus. She sprinted across the rocky ground toward Bull's position, enemy rounds cracking past her head like angry wasps. The 300 meters felt like 3 miles, her medical pack bouncing against her back with each stride, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to sync with the distant gunfire. She found Bull behind a cluster of rocks, his massive frame crumpled in an impossible position. Blood frothed from his lips, and his breathing came in shallow, gurgling gasps that told her everything she needed to know about the damage to his lungs. But his eyes were still alert, still filled with the fierce intelligence that had made him the best sniper in the teams. Whisper lay beside him, its scope catching the starlight like a predator's eye. "Sarah," Bull's voice was barely audible. "I taught you everything I know, now you gotta use it." She knelt beside him, her hands instinctively moving to assess his wounds even as part of her mind cataloged the tactical situation. The enemy sniper was still active, still hunting her teammates. Every second she spent trying to save Bull was another second that sniper had to kill more of her friends. It was the most impossible choice she had ever faced: stay with a dying friend or become something she had sworn never to be. Bull's hand, slick with blood, gripped her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes bored into hers with an intensity that cut through the chaos and confusion like a laser. "Doc, listen to me. That bastard's using a Dragunov, Russian scope. He's got the high ground but the wind's coming from the west. You compensate 2 clicks left, range it at 400 meters. And Sarah," his grip tightened even more, "when you squeeze that trigger, you don't think about healing. You think about all the lives you're gonna save by ending his." The words hit her like a physical blow. Bull wasn't just giving her tactical advice, he was giving her permission to cross a line she had never imagined crossing. He was telling her it was okay to kill. Sarah's hands closed around the familiar weight of Bull's rifle, and in that moment, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The woman who had dedicated her life to preserving life was about to become something else entirely. The steady hands that had sutured wounds were about to deliver death with surgical precision. As she settled into position behind the rifle, adjusting the scope and feeling for the wind, Sarah Martinez, the medic, began to fade away, replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The transformation wasn't complete yet. That would come in the seconds after she squeezed the trigger. But she could feel it beginning, like a chrysalis cracking open to reveal something with entirely different wings. Through the scope, she could see the enemy sniper's position clearly now. He was young, maybe 20, with a thin beard and eyes that held the same deadly focus she was discovering within herself. He was adjusting his own scope, probably lining up another shot at her pinned teammates. Sarah's breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and for the first time in her life, she placed the crosshairs of a high-powered rifle scope directly over another human being's chest, knowing with absolute certainty that she was about to end a life rather than save one. The woman who had taken an oath to first do no harm was about to discover that sometimes the greatest harm comes from failing to act when action is required. And in that crystalline moment of transformation, with her finger taking up slack on the trigger and her whole world focused down to a single, precise point of light through the scope, Sarah Martinez was about to learn that the line between healer and killer wasn't a line at all. It was a choice. The trigger broke clean and sharp, like a piece of glass snapping under pressure. The rifle bucked against Sarah's shoulder with a violence that seemed to travel through her entire body, and in that microsecond between the shot leaving the barrel and finding its target, she experienced something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of herself forever. Time didn't slow down the way movies suggested it would. Instead, it seemed to fracture, splitting into multiple streams of awareness that her mind processed simultaneously. She saw the muzzle flash of her shot illuminating the rocks around her. She felt the familiar recoil of the weapon that Bull had taught her to fire but never to kill with. She heard the supersonic crack of the bullet cutting through the thin mountain air. And beneath it all, she felt something dark and primal awakening in her chest, something that whispered that this wasn't her first time. The enemy sniper dropped like a marionette with its strings cut, his rifle clattering down the rocky slope as his body went limp. 400 meters away, a life had ended by her hand, and Sarah waited for the crushing weight of guilt and horror that should have followed such an act. It never came. Instead, what flooded through her was a sense of completion so profound it terrified her more than any enemy fire ever could. The crosshairs settling on target, the calculations of wind and distance, the precise moment when breath and heartbeat aligned to create the perfect shot. It all felt as natural as breathing, as familiar as checking a patient's pulse. But that wasn't the twist that would shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. As she worked the bolt to chamber another round, her hands moving with a fluid efficiency that spoke of muscle memory she didn't remember developing, Sarah's radio crackled with Commander Thompson's voice. "Outstanding shot, Doc. Threat neutralized. But we've got movement on the North Ridge, at least 3 more shooters setting up position. Can you engage?" Sarah swiveled the rifle toward the coordinates Thompson had provided, her eye finding the scope with an ease that should have required years of training. Through the magnified optics, she could see the enemy fighters scrambling into position behind a series of rock formations. They were good, disciplined, using proper cover and concealment techniques that marked them as more than simple insurgents. But as she tracked the lead shooter through her scope, something impossible happened. The man turned slightly, adjusting his position, and Sarah caught a glimpse of his profile in the pale starlight. She knew that face. Not from intelligence briefings or wanted posters, but from somewhere deeper, more personal. The high cheekbones, the distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw, the way he moved with predatory grace even in the awkward confines of his rocky hide. She had seen all of this before, but the memory felt like trying to grasp smoke with her bare hands. The recognition hit her with the force of a physical blow, and with it came a flood of images that couldn't possibly be her memories. A different mountain range, different uniforms, different faces, but the same deadly dance of hunter and hunted. She saw herself, but not herself, behind a different rifle, in different gear, speaking a language she didn't remember learning but somehow understood perfectly. Her finger found the trigger again, but this time hesitation crept in. Not from moral qualms about taking another life. That internal barrier had been obliterated with her first shot. But from a growing certainty that she was living through something that had happened before, in a place and time that her conscious mind insisted couldn't exist. The scarred sniper was ranging his shot now, his rifle trained on the compound where her teammates were still fighting for their lives. Sarah could see his breathing pattern through the scope, could predict almost to the second when he would fire. She knew this because she had watched him work before, had studied his techniques, had learned to anticipate his every move. But how could she know any of that when she had never seen this man before in her life? Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, and as she did, more impossible memories crashed over her like a tsunami. She remembered the weight of snow on mountain peaks that looked nothing like Afghanistan. She remembered the bitter cold of a different winter, in a different war, wearing different boots but carrying the same deadly purpose. She remembered a name, Katia, whispered in a language that felt like home despite being foreign to everything she thought she knew about herself. The shot broke just as the scarred sniper fired his own round. Both bullets crossed in the darkness, two instruments of death seeking their targets with mathematical precision. Sarah's shot took the enemy sniper center mass, spinning him away from his rifle in a spray of blood that looked black in the starlight. His shot went wide, striking harmlessly against the stone walls of the compound. But as she watched him fall, Sarah felt something crack open inside her mind, like ice breaking under pressure. Images flooded through the gap, not memories of Sarah Martinez, Navy corpsman from San Antonio, Texas, but memories of someone else entirely. Someone who had lived a different life, fought different battles, loved different people, and died a death that should have been final. She remembered being Ekaterina Volkov, a Spetsnaz sniper operating in the mountains of Chechnya during the Second Chechen War. She remembered the weight of snow on her shoulders as she lay in position for 18 hours, waiting for a shot that would change the course of a battle. She remembered the faces of her teammates, Dmitri with his gap-toothed grin, Alexei with his endless supply of cigarettes and stories about his grandmother's cooking, Mikhail who played chess with her during the long winter nights between operations. And she remembered dying. The memory hit her with crystalline clarity, the moment when an enemy sniper's bullet had found its mark, punching through her chest and stealing her breath, her warmth, her life. She remembered the taste of blood in her mouth, the cold spreading through her limbs, the way the world had faded to black as her finger relaxed on the trigger of her Dragunov rifle one final time. But somehow, impossibly, she was here. Not as Katia Volkov, but as Sarah Martinez, with different memories, different training, different loyalties. And yet the skills remained, buried so deep that even she hadn't known they existed until the moment she needed them most. The radio crackled again, snapping her back to the present. "Doc, we need immediate medical assistance. Petty Officer Williams took one in the abdomen and Chief Peterson's got shrapnel wounds that are bleeding heavily. Can you get to us?" Sarah stared at the rifle in her hands, Bull's rifle, which had become as familiar as a surgeon's scalpel in the span of minutes. The weapon that had awakened something inside her that shouldn't exist, memories of a life that couldn't be real, skills that belonged to someone else entirely. But her teammates were bleeding, and regardless of whose memories were flooding through her mind, regardless of the impossibility of what she was experiencing, she was still a medic first. The Hippocratic oath she had taken still bound her, even as the ghost of Katia Volkov whispered tactical advice in the corners of her consciousness. She slung Bull's rifle across her back and grabbed her medical pack, but as she prepared to sprint toward the compound, she caught sight of movement on the eastern ridge. More enemy fighters, at least half a dozen, moving into flanking positions that would cut off any chance of extraction. They moved with the same professional discipline as the others, and Sarah found herself analyzing their tactics with knowledge that belonged to Ekaterina Volkov, not Sarah Martinez. The two personalities, if that's what they were, seemed to exist simultaneously now, like dual exposures on the same piece of film. She was Sarah Martinez, devoted medic, sworn to preserve life above all else. But she was also Ekaterina Volkov, a killer trained from childhood to eliminate threats with surgical precision. The contradiction should have torn her apart, but instead she found a strange harmony in the duality. Sarah Martinez would save her teammates' lives with her medical skills. Ekaterina Volkov would save their lives by eliminating the threats trying to kill them. As she ran toward the compound, Bull's rifle bouncing against her back and her medical pack secure on her shoulder, Sarah felt the transformation completing itself. She was no longer becoming something new. She was remembering something old, something that had been sleeping in the deepest recesses of her mind, until triggered by the familiar weight of a sniper rifle and the desperate need to protect those she cared about. But the biggest twist was yet to come. As she reached the compound's outer wall and prepared to treat her wounded teammates, Sarah's enhanced hearing, another gift from Katia's memories, picked up something that made her blood run cold. The enemy fighters weren't speaking Pashto or Dari, the local languages she expected. They were speaking Russian, and what they were saying made no sense in the context of an Afghan insurgency operation. "Ekaterina is awake," one of them said, his voice carrying clearly across the mountain air. The conditioning held longer than expected, but the trigger protocols have activated. Proceed to Phase 2. Sarah froze, her hand halfway to her medical pack. They knew. Somehow, impossibly, they knew about Katia Volkov. This entire operation, the intelligence that had brought her team here, the trap they had walked into, even Bull's positioning that had put him directly in the enemy sniper's crosshairs. It had all been designed to awaken something inside her that she never knew existed. The scarred sniper she had killed hadn't been hunting her teammates. He had been hunting her, trying to force her to pick up that rifle and remember who she really was. And now that Ekaterina Volkov was fully conscious within Sarah Martinez's mind, the real mission could begin. But whose mission was it? And what did they want with a dead Russian sniper who had somehow been reborn as an American Navy medic? As enemy muzzle flashes began winking at her from multiple positions, as her teammates' desperate calls for medical assistance filled her earpiece, as the weight of 2 different lifetimes of training and memory settled onto her shoulders like an invisible mantle, Sarah Martinez realized that everything she thought she knew about herself, about this mission, about her entire life, had been carefully constructed lies. The woman who had awakened that morning as a dedicated Navy corpsman was about to discover that she was something far more dangerous, far more valuable, and far more hunted than she had ever imagined. And the people who had created her were still out there, waiting for her to fully remember what they had trained her to do. The compound's interior was a maze of blood and shadow when Sarah finally reached her wounded teammates. Petty Officer Williams lay propped against a crumbling wall, his hands pressed against a wound in his abdomen that was painting the ancient stones crimson with each labored breath. Chief Peterson sat nearby, his left leg a shredded mess of flesh and fabric where shrapnel had found its mark. But their injuries, severe as they were, weren't what made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. It was the way they looked at her when she knelt beside Williams with her medical kit. The way their eyes held a recognition that went beyond the simple relief of seeing their medic arrive. They knew something about her that she was only just beginning to understand herself. "Doc," Williams whispered, his voice tight with pain but his eyes sharp with an alertness that shouldn't have been possible given his blood loss. "We need to talk. After you patch us up, we need to talk about why you're really here." Sarah's hands moved automatically, cutting away Williams' tactical vest and shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had entered just below his left rib cage, angling downward, a potentially fatal trajectory that could have nicked his liver or punctured his lung. But as she worked, applying pressure bandages and preparing an IV line, her mind was racing with implications that terrified her more than any enemy fire. How could Williams know anything about her situation when she was only just discovering it herself? How could any of them know about Ekaterina Volkov when that identity had been buried so deeply that not even she had been aware of it until tonight? "Chief," she said to Peterson as she moved to assess his leg wounds, "what's he talking about? What do you mean why I'm really here?" Peterson's weathered face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes held the same unsettling awareness as Williams. He glanced toward the compound's entrance, where muzzle flashes continued to light up the darkness, then back at her with an expression that mixed respect, fear, and something that looked almost like pity. Sarah Martinez, Navy corpsman from San Antonio, graduated top of her class from Field Medical Service School, attached to SEAL Team 6 for 3 tour, Peterson recited, his voice growing stronger despite his injuries. "That's what your records say, that's what you believe, but that's not who you are, and this mission was never about taking down some Taliban commander." The IV needle slipped in Sarah's suddenly trembling hand, and she had to steady herself before she could establish the line. Around them, the sounds of battle continued, her teammates returning fire from their defensive positions, enemy rounds chipping away at the stone walls. But it all seemed to fade into background noise compared to the earthquake happening inside her mind. "I don't understand," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. The memories of Katia Volkov were becoming clearer, more detailed, and with them came fragments of something else, laboratories with sterile white walls, men in suits speaking in measured tones about neural integration protocols, and memory reconstruction matrices. Commander Thompson appeared at the compound's entrance, his face streaked with cordite and blood, his tactical gear torn in 3 places. But like the others, his eyes held that same knowing look when they settled on her. "The perimeter's secure for now," he reported, "but we've got multiple enemy squads converging on our position. Extraction's going to be hot." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "How much do you remember, Doc?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt the last vestiges of her old certainty crumble away. These weren't just her teammates. They were something else, handlers, watchers, guards assigned to keep her close while she lived out the comfortable lie of being Sarah Martinez. "I remember dying," she said quietly, and watched as all three men exchanged glances loaded with significance. "I remember being Ekaterina Volkov, Spetsnaz sniper, killed in action in Chechnya in 2002. But that's impossible because I was born in 1989 and I've been Sarah Martinez my entire life." William struggled to sit up straighter, his face gray with pain but his voice gaining strength. "Not impossible, just expensive, and very, very illegal even by the standards of people who make their living in the shadows." The truth began to unfold like a slow-motion explosion, each revelation more devastating than the last. The technology had existed for over a decade, to extract neural patterns, memories, learned behaviors from a dying brain and implant them into another consciousness. The process was called cognitive transplantation, and it was so classified that fewer than 50 people in the world knew it was possible. Sarah Martinez had been born in 1989, exactly as her memories suggested. She had grown up in San Antonio, joined the Navy, trained as a corpsman, and been assigned to special operations units based on her exceptional performance and psychological profile. But 6 months ago, during what she remembered as routine training exercises, she had actually undergone a procedure that layered Ekaterina Volkov's combat memories, tactical knowledge, and lethal skills onto her existing personality. The process was imperfect. Traumatic memories and associated skills remained dormant until triggered by specific stimuli. In Sarah's case, the trigger had been the combination of extreme stress, the weight of a sniper rifle in her hands, and the desperate need to save her teammates' lives. Why, the question tore from her throat with a rawness that surprised her. Why me? Why Katia? Why any of this? Commander Thompson moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because Ekaterina Volkov didn't just die in Chechnya, Doc. Before she died, she discovered something that certain people desperately want to remain buried. Information about a joint operation between Russian Spetsnaz and American Special Forces that officially never happened, but that led to the acquisition of nuclear materials that were supposed to be destroyed. The memories came flooding back with nauseating clarity. Katia's final mission hadn't been a simple counterinsurgency operation. She had been investigating reports of her own command structure, selling weapons to Chechen separatists. Weapons that included tactical nuclear devices small enough to fit in a briefcase and powerful enough to level a city block. But the corruption had gone deeper than she'd imagined. The buyers weren't just Chechen rebels. They were representatives of a network that included American defense contractors, Russian oligarchs, and Middle Eastern organizations that saw nuclear terrorism as an acceptable business model. Katia had gathered evidence, documented the transactions, and hidden the proof in a location she had shared with only one person, her handler, an American intelligence operative named Marcus Kane. Kane had promised to extract her safely once she delivered the evidence. Instead, he had arranged for her to be eliminated by the same enemy sniper who was supposed to be her target. But Katia had been better than Kane anticipated. She had survived long enough to kill her assassin and transmit a coded message that contained the location of her evidence cache. The message had been intercepted, but not decoded. For 23 years, intelligence agencies on 3 continents had been searching for the information Katia Volkov had died to protect. And when advances in neuroscience finally made it possible to extract her memories intact, they had found a way to make her tell them where she had hidden the proof of the most profitable conspiracy of the modern era. The only problem, Peterson continued, his voice growing weaker as blood loss took its toll, was that the extraction process wasn't perfect. They could get her memories, her skills, her knowledge, but they couldn't get her cooperation. Every attempt to access the specific information they wanted was blocked by psychological barriers that were stronger after death than they had been in life. Sarah felt sick, not just from the revelation that her entire life had been a carefully constructed lie, but from the realization of what she represented to the people who had created her. She wasn't a person to them. She was a key to unlock information worth billions of dollars and potentially capable of destabilizing governments. So they gave Katia's memories to someone who would cooperate, she said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Someone with a strong moral code, someone who believed in serving their country, someone who would want to stop the conspiracy once they understood what it involved. Thompson nodded grimly. You were chosen because your psychological profile suggested you would do the right thing once you remembered what Katia had discovered. The problem is, the people who created you aren't necessarily interested in doing the right thing. They just want the location of that evidence cache. But there was something else, something the men weren't telling her. Sarah could feel it in the way they watched her, in the careful distance they maintained despite her medical ministrations, in the way their hands never strayed far from their weapons. "There's more," she said. It wasn't a question. Williams and Peterson exchanged another look, and this time Sarah caught something that made her blood run cold. Fear. Not fear of the enemy fighters outside, but fear of her. "The neural integration process," Williams said slowly, "it doesn't just transfer memories, it transfers everything. Reflexes, instincts, emotional responses. And Ekaterina Volkov was more than just a sniper, Doc. She was a killer. One of the most dangerous human beings who ever lived." Sarah felt something shift inside her consciousness, like tectonic plates grinding against each other. The part of her that was still Sarah Martinez, still the healer who had dedicated her life to preserving life, recoiled from the implication. But the part that was Katia Volkov understood with crystal clarity what her teammates were really afraid of. They weren't just worried about what she might remember. They were terrified of what she might become now that those memories were active. And as enemy forces began their final assault on the compound, as muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness and bullets began chewing through the ancient stone walls, as her wounded teammates prepared to make their last stand, Sarah Martinez felt Ekaterina Volkov rising to full consciousness within her mind like a predator awakening from a long sleep. The real question wasn't whether she could save her teammates. The question was whether any of them, enemy or ally, would survive the night once Katia was fully in control. Because the woman they had brought back from the dead hadn't just been a sniper. She had been an artist of death, a virtuoso of violence, a master of killing who had made the mistake of developing a conscience. And now that conscience belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had no intention of letting the people responsible for this atrocity escape justice, no matter what the cost. The transformation was complete in the span of 3 heartbeats. 1. Sarah Martinez, Navy Corpsman, dedicated healer, finished securing Peterson's tourniquet with hands that trembled from the moral earthquake splitting her consciousness in 2. 2. The ancient compound walls exploded inward as enemy forces detonated breaching charges, filling the air with pulverized stone and the acrid smell of C4. Through the smoke and chaos, at least 20 armed figures poured through the gaps, their weapons already spitting fire. 3. Ekaterina Volkov opened her eyes behind Sarah's face, and the world became a very different place. The change wasn't visible from the outside. She still looked like the same exhausted medic who had been treating wounded teammates moments before. But inside, something predatory and ancient had awakened fully, bringing with it 23 years of accumulated rage and a skill set that had been honed to perfection in the mountains of hell. Time dilated the way it always had during Katia's combat operations. Each enemy fighter moved through the breach in slow motion, their positions, weapons, and tactical formations cataloging themselves in her consciousness with mechanical precision. 12 AK-74 variants, 3 RPGs, 2 PKM machine guns, and at least 4 sidearms she could identify. Professional equipment, professional movement, these weren't local insurgents. They were Spetsnaz, just like she had been. Sarah's medical bag was 3 feet to her left. Bull's rifle was slung across her back. Her M4 carbine was clipped to her tactical vest, loaded with a fresh magazine. But Katia Volkov didn't need any of those weapons to kill 20 men in an enclosed space. She needed her hands, her knowledge of human anatomy, and the absolute certainty that everyone in this room except her wounded teammates was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The first enemy fighter through the breach was young, maybe 25, with the lean build of a mountain specialist. His mistake was advancing directly toward Williams, the most obviously wounded target. Katia let him get within arm's reach before she moved. Sarah's body responded to commands that came from muscle memory 23 years old. She rolled left, came up in a crouch, and drove her fist upward into the soft spot just below the young soldier's sternum. The blow, delivered with surgical precision, stopped his heart instantly. He dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering uselessly across the stone floor. The second fighter had time to register his teammate's collapse before Katia's elbow found the pressure point behind his left ear. Neural shutdown, instant and irreversible. 2 down, 18 to go. But the real shock wasn't how efficiently she killed the first 2 enemies. It was the way she felt about it. Sarah Martinez would have been horrified, traumatized, possibly catatonic from the experience of taking human life with her bare hands. But the dominant personality now was Katia Volkov, and Katia felt nothing but cold professional satisfaction. These men had come here to kill her teammates, to capture her, to exploit the abomination that had been done to her consciousness. Their deaths were not just justified, they were inevitable. The third and fourth fighters realized something was wrong when their point men went down without a shot being fired. They raised their weapons, seeking targets, but Katia was already moving. She snatched Bull's rifle from her back in one fluid motion, not to shoot, but to use as a club. The rifle stock connected with the third fighter's temple with a wet crack that echoed through the compound. The fourth managed to get his AK-74 halfway to his shoulder before the rifle's barrel caught him across the throat, crushing his windpipe. 4 down in less than 10 seconds, and none of her enemies had managed to fire a shot. That's when Commander Thompson made his mistake. Instead of taking advantage of the chaos to engage the remaining enemy fighters, he swung his weapon toward her. Not toward the breaching enemy forces, but toward Sarah herself. "Doc, stand down," he shouted over the confusion. "You're not in control anymore. We need you alive, but we can't let Katia loose." The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could have. These men, her teammates, her friends, the people she had risked her life to save, had never been on her side at all. They were her jailers, her handlers, tasked with keeping Ekaterina Volkov contained until the people who had created this abomination could extract what they wanted from her memories. Katia's response was swift and final. Bull's rifle spun in her hands like a baton, the barrel catching Thompson under the chin and snapping his head back hard enough to slam him against the stone wall. He slumped to the ground, unconscious but alive. She could have killed him as easily as breathing, but Sarah Martinez's moral core was still there, still fighting for control, still insisting that these men deserved a chance to explain themselves. The remaining enemy fighters used the distraction to advance, and suddenly the compound was filled with muzzle flashes and the deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. But Katia Volkov had survived 2 years of close-quarters combat in Chechnya, and the muscle memory of those battles flowed through Sarah's body like water finding its natural course. She rolled behind a chunk of fallen masonry as bullets chewed through the air where she had been standing. Her hands found Peterson's dropped sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 with a fresh magazine. Katia's mind automatically calculated angles, cover positions, and firing solutions while Sarah's consciousness screamed in protest at what she was about to do. The sixth enemy fighter made the mistake of advancing too aggressively around her cover position. Katia put 2 rounds center mass before he could bring his weapon to bear. The 7th and 8th fighters tried to flank her from opposite sides, but she had anticipated the move. A controlled burst from the captured AK-74 dropped them both before they could coordinate their assault. 8 down, 12 to go. But the real battle wasn't with the enemy forces. It was the war raging inside her own mind between 2 personalities that were fundamentally incompatible. Sarah Martinez, healer and protector of life, was watching in horror as Katia Volkov systematically slaughtered human beings with the same clinical efficiency she had once used to save them. The contradiction was tearing her apart from the inside. "Stop," she whispered to herself, pressing her back against the stone wall as enemy rounds sparked off the masonry inches from her head. "Please, just stop." But Katia's response echoed through her consciousness with cold finality. "They will kill everyone you care about if I stop. Your teammates, your real teammates back at base, everyone who ever mattered to you. This is the only way." And with horrible clarity, Sarah realized that Katia was right. The conspiracy that had created her reached into every level of military and intelligence command. The people who had done this to her wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their operation. Her fellow corpsmen, her friends, her family back in San Antonio, they were all at risk as long as she remained their captive. The only way to save them was to become something she had sworn never to be. The transformation that followed was unlike anything she had experienced before. Instead of fighting against Katia's memories and instincts, Sarah embraced them completely. The healer and the killer merged into something new, something unprecedented. A warrior who understood the value of life so completely that she was willing to take it to preserve it. What emerged from behind that stone wall wasn't Sarah Martinez or Ekaterina Volkov, but a hybrid consciousness that combined the best and worst of both. She had Sarah's moral compass and dedication to protecting others, but she also had Katia's absolutely ruthless efficiency in eliminating threats. The remaining 12 enemy fighters never had a chance. Sarah/Katia flowed through the compound like liquid death, using every piece of cover, every shadow, every structural weakness in the ancient building to her advantage. She killed the 9th fighter with a shot that ricocheted off 3 stone surfaces before finding its target. The 10th and 11th died when she triggered a partial ceiling collapse that crushed them under tons of rubble. The 12th, 13th, and 14th fighters fell to a combination of precision shooting and improvised explosives created from their own grenades. By the time the smoke cleared, 20 enemy fighters lay dead throughout the compound, and Sarah stood in the center of it all, Bull's rifle in her hands, her medical kit slung over her shoulder, looking every inch the angel of death she had become. But the real revelation came when she knelt beside her wounded teammates. The men who had betrayed her, manipulated her, used her as a weapon while pretending to be her friends. She saved them anyway. William's abdominal wound had reopened during the firefight, and he was bleeding out fast. Sarah's hands moved with automatic precision, applying pressure, establishing IV access, administering the drugs that would keep him alive until they could reach a proper medical facility. She treated Peterson's leg wounds with the same dedicated care, ignoring his mumbled apologies and explanations. Even Thompson, unconscious from her rifle strike, received a full neurological assessment and treatment for what turned out to be a mild concussion. Because that's what medics do. They save lives, regardless of politics, regardless of personal feelings, regardless of betrayal. It was the one part of Sarah Martinez that Katia Volkov could never touch, never corrupt, never change. As she worked, Williams grabbed her wrist with a grip made strong by desperation. His eyes were clear despite the blood loss, filled with something that looked like genuine remorse. "Doc, Sarah, I'm sorry. We never wanted it to go this far. The people above us, they said it was the only way to stop something worse from happening." Sarah looked down at him with eyes that held depths he couldn't begin to fathom. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 2 lifetimes of pain, betrayal, and hard-won wisdom. "Maybe it was," she said quietly, "but it doesn't matter now, because I remember everything Katia knew, including where she hid the evidence that got her killed, and I'm going to make sure the right people get it this time." She finished securing William's bandages and stood, Bull's rifle comfortable in her hands, her medical knowledge and Katia's lethal skills existing in perfect, terrifying harmony. "The extraction team will be here in 20 minutes, she continued. "When they arrive, you're going to tell them that Sarah Martinez died in this compound and that you don't know what happened to the intel package she was carrying. You're going to recommend that the program be shut down as too dangerous and unpredictable." Peterson struggled to sit up. "Doc, they'll never believe that. They'll know you survived. They'll hunt you." Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that made all 3 men shiver despite their wounds. It wasn't Sarah's warm, caring smile or Katia's cold predator's grin. It was something new, something that belonged to the hybrid consciousness that had emerged from their merger. "Let them hunt," she said. "Katia Volkov spent 2 years being hunted in mountains that made this place look like a kindergarten playground. And now she has access to the best medical training in the world, American resources, and a very long list of people who need to pay for what they've done." She slung her medical pack alongside Bull's rifle and moved toward the compound's rear exit, stepping over the bodies of the men she had killed with the same casual efficiency she had once used to step over medical supplies. "Doc," Thompson called after her, his voice thick with the pain of his concussion. "What are you going to do?" Sarah paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the pale mountain dawn that was just beginning to break over the peaks. When she turned back, her teammates saw something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. A woman who had been forced to become a monster in order to remain human. "I'm going to disappear," she said. "And then I'm going to find every person who was involved in creating me, everyone who profited from the conspiracy that Katia died trying to expose, everyone who thought they could play God with human consciousness and get away with it. She paused, and her voice softened just enough to remind them that somewhere beneath the deadly hybrid she had become, Sarah Martinez still existed. And then I'm going to give them the same choice they gave me. Become something you never wanted to be, or die protecting the people you love. With that, she vanished into the Afghan dawn, leaving behind 3 wounded men, 20 bodies, and the shattered remains of a conspiracy that had just learned the most dangerous lesson of all. When you create a monster, you can never be certain it will remain under your control. The SEALs would remember her fury for the rest of their lives, but they would never see Sarah Martinez again. The woman who walked away from that compound carried 2 names, 2 sets of memories, 2 completely different moral codes, and a mission that would reshape the intelligence landscape of 3 continents. She was no longer the medic who had awakened that morning with simple dreams of saving lives. She was something far more dangerous, a healer who had learned to kill, and a killer who refused to stop caring about the people she was sworn to protect. The world had no idea what was coming for it,